Hello, Professor Rick. Welcome to the Press Club's Hour in the Now series. And so glad you're with us, me, on today, December 7th, 2020. My goodness. Anyway, if you would kindly introduce yourself, tell us what you do, that would be wonderful.
Jessica, thanks so much for the invite. Always honored to talk to you and your classes, and it's fantastic to get an invite from the Press Club. So my name is Rick Rockwell. I'm the Chief Communications Officer at Webster University and Associate Vice President at Webster University in that role. What I do is provide leadership really on communication issues to 4 different departments at the university, those departments being a mix. We have one area that's strategic communications, that's really 3 different departments, but also covers some other areas. So that would cover both strategic communications as an umbrella and as a specific unit, public relations, community engagement. And then we also, besides those 3 departments, we also have marketing. That's the 4th. Marketing and creative services, and that covers both advertising and traditional marketing, but also our website and digital operations. We also do a lot of work for our Office of Advancement. So advancement communications is part of the strategic communication structure of what we do. We are a relatively small unit. Sorry, my camera went off there for a bit, not sure why. There's basically 21 of us, and so I provide leadership for that group of 20 folks. And these days in the pandemic, that means we actually also have a group of contractors and consultants who work with us, and we usually work with outside agencies too in the St. Louis area that folks may be associated with, but we also have some internal contractors working with us. A big project that we just completed about 3 weeks ago, you may be aware, as we launched a new website. That is a huge undertaking for the university. I'm very proud of that work because it's a 2+ year project that is a website is never done. If people understand websites, they're a communication ecosystem on to their own, but getting to publication took us more than 2 years. And so I'm very happy with that process. And many of those consultants worked with us on those things, internal contractors for us, but we also have external contractors we work with, some who may have connections to the Press Club. We work with Vector Communications on public relations issues. We work with Lentz and Associates. These are folks who provide us good public relations help. We have a very small public relations department, so sometimes we need their help, and we get help from other contractors too as needed. So I hope that's sufficient.
You've helped me remove some of the questions I had already. So, but in the context of COVID, did these plans say for the newer, robust web presence, did criteria change?
Yes, criteria certainly changed. Timeline certainly changed. One thing I've learned about the pandemic is it just takes much longer to get things done because it's harder. Communication is essential, and I think people are finding out how essential communication is during these times. But we're all used to these Zoom calls and other sorts of calls that we're doing, but you're not present. And so the process of emailing and calling and doing video chats and other things, it seems like the communication process is constant now. But because it's constant, I also think that sometimes it's less effective. for some folks. You just see folks tuning out on calls. I hope you didn't feel this way when accidentally my video went off, but you'll see people's videos go off on a call. I was on a call this afternoon with about 45 people, and some folks you see are present and engaged, and then all of a sudden their camera goes off, and you go, "Are they still there? Are we really connecting?" And so this is one of those pieces of communication that takes much longer for us to actually get work done, and working in a completely, even though we're back in the office at Webster University. A lot of folks are in the office maybe 1 day a week, or 2 days a week, or 3 days a week. Some are back 5 days a week. The office is no longer the nexus point that it used to be. So to get the work done means a lot of extra planning, a lot of extra work. And so launching a website in a pandemic is not ideal, and was not our plan. Of course, I originally this website was supposed to launch in the spring and didn't launch until the middle of the fall. And so you see many months added time, I think, because of the pandemic. Pandemic, I think, has had other effects on that process too. I think the wear and tear on morale and personnel during the pandemic is something to be considered, not just in communication shops, but all through the business world. I'm sure people are dealing with this, and the need to be present, I think, in a communication role. And what I mean by being present is to be both responsive to the community's needs, and also to be thoughtful about what the community needs before those needs are expressed. So to try to get out in front of communication issues. And really, since March, our communication unit has been very focused on emergency and urgent communications to our community. And so that is a very different communication shop than a lot of folks in the educational sector are used to. That is much more like what a newspaper runs like, or much more like what a broadcasting operation runs like. And as someone who's worked on both newspapers and television stations, radio stations, that's not a cultural shift for me. But I think that some people on our staff who may not come from those particular backgrounds have been challenged by this year, and the need to be present to the community on a 24/7 basis. And we often say that in our unit prior to the pandemic, but the pandemic has put us through a test like nothing else. And usually when we deal with crisis communication, we can take a rest after a long crisis. Might be 2 weeks or 2.5 weeks or something like that. What are we in, 9 months in, and we're still dealing with this. So that's been a test, and I think the folks who were able to cope with that have learned a lot of things during the pandemic, and folks who were unable to cope then made their own choices to move on and to do different things. And so that's part of the reason we're running with so many contractors. Before the pandemic, I would not normally have contractors who were daily contributors to the staff. And I would say since April, we've had sometimes a small group, sometimes a larger group, aiding us in trying to get the work that is necessary finished.
Thank you. It was very informative. From the standpoint of when you were ushered out of the university, everybody was ushered out. What did you do in that, those days, couple of weeks into the pivot, into that pivot?
Well, I think at Webster, we're proud of the fact that It was more or less a 72-hour pivot, and instructors and faculty members and staff had to get ready for a completely remote operation. And we're mostly a hybrid operation these days. About these days, probably only about 10 or 12% of our classes are meeting face to face in any way, shape, or form. And we're recording this during finals week. So pretty soon that will be changing. We walked into this semester, the fall semester, with only about 25% of our classes meeting face to face. And then as the pandemic grew worse this semester, we scaled those down. But yes, going into this semester, we transitioned not completely back to a full-time in-space workplace, but shifting to a completely remote workplace, which we did, as said, in about a 72-hour span. Was a test, and my folks will tell you that I'm one of those folks who hates meetings. I'd like there to be less meetings so that we can actually do the work. It has meant more meetings, and it has meant me, of all people, saying, no, we have to have more meetings to walk through everything of what we're doing in very careful and planned ways. I was someone who might have a staff meeting 2 or 3 times a year at the most, gather the whole staff together. Because the staff at Webster is highly professional. Some folks have been with us for 20 plus years. They know their business. They're a great professional group. And this is a group that, as a manager, you don't need to stand over their shoulders. What you need to do is provide them a good atmosphere for creation, and then check in with them and be a good colleague to them. But what my philosophy has been during the pandemic is for me to know where people might be and what they're doing. I can't walk down the hall anymore and just kind of poke my head into a room or over someone's shoulder and say, how are you doing today? And what is this? And do you want to talk about this project or those sorts of things? You lose all of that social interaction where actually there's business things going on, but it's a much softer sort of management structure. And so in losing that, I have felt that we need a weekly gathering of everyone to provide community and also to set up some of that natural, I'm working on this project over here. Well, I'm working on this project over here. Because those two hands don't meet in the hallway anymore, they need some place to discuss those things. So we have a weekly staff meeting now, which I doubt that I would keep that if we were in a face-to-face setting. But it's those sorts of things that you see the management of managing folks in a completely remote operation. Even though many of us are back here day to day, not, I would say 70% of my staff is not here present today. They're still remote. Again, to cut down on the density in the office space, to make it safer for us to work in these spaces. So balancing the healthcare needs with the business needs has made some real adjustments in how we go about what we do.
Yeah, you're speaking to that collaborative, the team collaborative, that, it's nuanced in the face of this pandemic, certainly. And I appreciate the definitive aspects of what has transpired in these, last 10 months. What about your meetings with the president, the chancellor? After all, they're worried. They're not in communications per se, and they depend on your department, for heaven's sakes.
Well, we have this kind of to be safe, kind of odd way of working these days, where I work on the same floor in the administration building as the chancellor. Um, and she's literally, I'm going to say, I don't know, maybe 100 yards away from me in this building, maybe even closer than that. And so she's here today, but I haven't seen her personally. But I've been in a meeting with her, in a remote meeting. So she'll be in a remote meeting down the hallway from me, and we'll be gathered. And I actually took a walk down to the president's office today, and he was otherwise occupied, but I had a phone call with him. And so what we have to do is different types of communication for different sorts um, of needs. And so it's not always a Zoom call, or sometimes it's a phone call. What I do find is that we used to do more in not always informal, but if there was a need, I would see myself doing a phone call and setting up like a joint call on my cell phone for 3 or 4 folks. We never do that these days anymore. It's more, all right, let me set up a Zoom. Everyone pile into the video chat room. We'll do that, and it's so much easier and faster to do that. So there have been some changes, I would say, in modernization of how we approach the communication structure and these sorts of things. Chancellor still has her set meetings. I'll go to a chancellor's cabinet meeting tomorrow, but we won't all be in the same room. We'll all just be in a Zoom call. So all the same communication functions that we had in the past just have to really adapt to the electronic tools that we have to use.
Mm-hmm. So, in terms of your relationships, globally, how has that evolved, in this time of COVID?
It's interesting. I actually think that the pandemic, it's hard to say anything nice about a pandemic, but a silver lining has been more connectivity internationally. And I think it's partially because we're all suffering from the same pandemic. We can all relate to each other and use that as a discussion point. I've had more work with the international campuses in the past 9 months than probably several years combined. Now, some of that is also related to the fact of the website project. So trying to launch, Webster has a very complex system when it comes to web and web communications. So we have a main US based website that, of course, you can see anywhere in the world. And that is the big website, and represents mostly the functions of things happening in the US, but it also talks about our international sites. Folks who know Webster know that we have 8 other campus sites throughout the world. And each one of those sites has its own website and its own URL address. And so the older the website, the bigger and more complex it is. So our Geneva website represents our oldest international campus, around for 40 plus years, and is fairly big. And then we have a smaller site in Tashkent for our folks in Uzbekistan. And so it runs the gamut between those different pieces. But and also I was on a call just last week with our site representative in Beijing, because of the communication issues and the way that the Chinese government looks at the web world. Our operation in Beijing and in Shanghai, they need to actually set up a website more for themselves and less with us in St. Louis being involved, to make the Chinese authorities happier about how that works. But I found that they were also extremely collaborative in the process and wanted our advice and wanted. Find myself on a call like this talking about which font is better for the website. Should we use Saban or what should we use? And so those are the sorts of conversations that we'll be having. So that is, to me, one of the silver linings of the pandemic is this stronger international connectivity with folks. And one of the things we did during the pandemic was also start a podcast. That the whole idea of the podcast was to link our international campuses, and we've had guests and other speakers on that podcast from literally every one of the 9 campus locations throughout the globe. We did one that had a panel literally on 3 different continents. So we had a panelist in Asia, a panelist in Europe, a panelist here in Webster Groves at the main campus. Those are the sorts of things that you can do in the Webster system, and really are fun when we talk about communication challenges.
Yeah, I was going to mention the podcast because as part of the Webster family, I mean, I've enjoyed them, and you can tell that the people who are producing them are enjoying them. I mean, there's a certain pride, I guess, with regard to putting these together, and they've been rich, really rich content. So give me some nuggets, some other golden nuggets, some anecdotes about these relationships, maybe some of the preoccupations that you've learned about in dealing with our foreign colleagues.
Well, interesting. I think a lot about our operations in Uzbekistan. That's a part of the world that I can only imagine. And I remember pulling out a section of the New York Times Magazine from this past year during the pandemic. They did a great pullout with pictures of Uzbekistan and things. And I keep that as sort of a reminder of who the location of where the folks there who I'm talking to, how to relate to them. It's interesting on the podcast. We had a interview with one of the folks who is in administration in Tashkent, and she's from the States, and she actually volunteered to go to Tashkent to help with that operation. Folks who don't know the Webster system sometimes are very surprised that we have what they might call an outpost, but we have more than 1,100 students in Tashkent now, with the possibility that within the next year or so, there might be more than 2,000 students in Uzbekistan. It's already our second largest operation outside of St. Louis, and it's going to start challenging Webster Groves for how many students it really has. And just hearing the stories from Tashkent, the stories of having to learn Russian, having the experience of a different government and what that means in a lockdown. So I think that interview very much impressed me about, we see the debates that we have in the US over masks and lockdowns and the issue of freedom. This was a person relating to the fact that there was a guard with a automatic weapon outside of her apartment complex, and she was clearly told to stay in the line of sight of that person and could go down to the drugstore, and then there would be things brought in, groceries and other things brought in to the courtyard of her apartment complex, and both learning the Russian to have that communication piece with those folks, but also the very different cultural aspect of lockdown meaning something very different in Tashkent than the debates over what a lockdown should be here in the United States. I think those are things that impressed me. I thought that was one of the best storytelling experiences that we had on the podcast, was hearing her story and being able to relate to it.
Yeah. Talk to me again, please, about the technology needs, and are you using, well, you're using Zoom more, but other technologies maybe that for which we're not aware that have come into play in the last several months?
Well, I would say for podcast production, somebody who's been involved in podcast production for many, many years, I was a big Skype user, and I've always felt that podcasts, you could open up the whole world to a podcast because you could record somebody. If you could get a connection to that person, a phone connection, um, it's more expensive, obviously, on a phone, but if you can get a Skype connection to that person. So in the past year, in producing the podcast, we've used Skype, we've used Cisco WebEx, we've used Zoom. These are all things that people should be very acquainted with now due to the pandemic. But I mean, even my mom will do a Skype call now. She doesn't necessarily like it, but she's acquainted with it and those sorts of things. And my mom is in her late 80s, so that just gives you kind of the perspective of the demographic shift to these technologies that a year ago she wouldn't even known what a Skype call was, I'm pretty sure. And so that sort of common everyday use, and I think that's a big communication shift for us to feel like, oh, we all know what those things are. We all know how to get on those things. We all know how to do an audio check now, those sorts of things. So as far as different technologies that maybe people haven't necessarily heard of, to go back to our website project, what I discovered in working on that project, we have a content management system that we get from a company called Omni Update, which is a vendor that does a lot of specialty work in the educational zone, in attracting contractors and others to help us work with this system. Very difficult to find anyone who understood that content management system. And so I just actually was on a call today with faculty and staff, some who do some writing for our website, and impressing on them that even though they may have been familiar with that system on our older website, that the new website sits on a completely upgraded piece of software for this Omni Update system. And so that they might have to train themselves for as much as 40 hours of video training to get themselves up to snuff to work even on the front end of some website construction. And so that is a system that we had to build time for those contractors and consultants to work with us to learn that system and then effectively build a website on that particular piece of technology. But I don't think that we're using any other different types of technologies that people wouldn't have already heard of. I still edit the podcast on Adobe Audition, which I, as an audio editor, have used Adobe Audition for many, many years. We use many of the same video systems that we've used for many, many years in video editing. So as far as platforms, I think that is the platform that some folks who might watch this might not be familiar with that.
It is interesting, we've become accustomed to the imperfections right now of some of this. And, you wonder really how long the audience will put up with the imperfections of the current status of communicating.
Well, I will tell you that I said something to you as we were setting up this call. I said, I'll try to shut some things off and turn off notices and other things so they won't affect your recording. It's difficult to get people to do that as someone who produces broadcasting product.
Right.
That is a fundamental. You ask people, please make it as quiet where you are as you can. And I think we've become much more accepting in the pandemic of interruptions and
Yes.
outside sounds and those sorts of things, and maybe a little bit more forgiving. Maybe there is a better sweet spot between the standards that we had pre-pandemic and the ones that we'll get to post-pandemic. I think there will be a lot more leeway in the audience to say, okay, I understand what's happening.
Yeah.
You can't, when people are not isolated from the greater world. And sometimes you just can't get clean audio recordings.
Right. So I want to go back to the stakeholders of an education, higher education institution, certainly the students. So going back now again to March, throughout this whole time, what have been the meetings like at your, in your meetings to address the needs, the preoccupations, the concerns of the student?
Well, I think Webster is very student-centered organization. The students come first. We talk quite a bit about trying to put students first. And so I think there's this fine line that we've tried to discover. And this is a debate, I think a nationwide debate that's going on. What is the best, how do we keep students engaged? How do we educate them? And is completely a remote environment the best environment for that education? And you even see experts like Dr. Anthony Fauci, I think, change their opinions. So at one point, I think during the pandemic, it was no, everybody needs to be remote. And now you hear Dr. Fauci, who I have a lot of respect for, say, well, let's try to keep students in school as much as we can in the classroom. And I think, not trying to cast aspersions on anyone here, but I think what we've found as educators in higher education during this process is that I'm not saying nothing is spread in classrooms, but with care, if people are following protocols and those sorts of things, the spread of the coronavirus inside a classroom is less likely. And I think there are even studies that are showing not much spread is happening in classrooms. The spread is happening in social spaces. It's happening at parties or gatherings, or bars, or other things along those lines, or at restaurants where too many people are present at a particular table, or other places. That's where we're seeing the spread. And this is typical. I mean, students want to come to college. They're not just here to study. They're here for personal growth. They're here for other things that are happening in their lives, to make their lives progress. And separating that social piece from the educational piece is difficult. And so how do you do that? I think those are the discussions that we have. How can we keep the community safe? We as we've discussed, we have taken more of a hybrid model. It's not we're all completely present and back to work. It's also we're not all completely remote. We're trying to do it by reducing density, by being careful with protocols. Here's my mask. Here's my mask.
Sorry, I should have had mine available for you.
It's right here on my desk. And so, but nobody's in my office, so I don't have to wear my mask right now. But it's close. It's ready. And so getting people to follow those protocols, which has taken some time. I mean, I know I was a very early mask adopter and someone who was careful about how many people were in a room. And as we've learned more about the aerosolized nature of the way that the virus spreads, taking more of that sort of care. My child goes to high school and wears a set of goggles on top of a mask. And this was something that we learned by interacting with health professionals. this summer, who, if you take a cue from nurses and other people who are out there, it's not just a mask, it's also protecting your eyes and doing other things when you're in potential places. So I mean, that's a personal choice for me and for my family. We always have some sort of other I have a face shield that I put over my mask so that we're doing this. But you can find methods, I think is what I'm getting at, to cope with the pandemic and find a mid ground between being completely present and just like pre-pandemic times, and also completely remote. Finding that space in between those two extremes is what we've tried to do.
Mm-hmm. So I would imagine the faculty dealing with the students can get a flavor for how they're feeling, about their confidence, about how, will I be able to make it through the term, through the semester with all this? I'm sure you hear stories from many of those on campus.
Well, it's finals week, and so what I've heard is this is a really challenging time. Students, I think all of us feel like we're running a very long marathon, and would like it to be over with. Just like we've talked about, projects and communication take longer in the pandemic. I think the students have the same feeling of how do they get their projects done? How do they get their research done? How do they interact with their professors in better ways? This too takes more time. And some institutions accelerated their calendars and said, we're not coming back after Thanksgiving. We reduced our in-person classes after Thanksgiving. But I think, we have been cognizant that students were challenged. But what I also heard, because I did some interviews, and we have a student who works on the podcast, and she did some interviews, and what we heard generally from all the students was they didn't want to be completely remote. They wanted this connectivity. They felt that sort of disconnection that they had for some months in the spring and summer. They wanted to get away from that. And so I would say that the results have been very positive and that the community has been very careful. But I do think we are cognizant of burnout among many members of our community, and care for that. And also just hearing from students that they wanted a college experience of some type. And we know that students were very upset that they couldn't have a commencement ceremony, and we've had to do a lot of things virtually. As a producer, I produced this year's video version of our commencement. I'm not sure I've ever produced anything so grand and so important, really, for the people watching, literally all over the world. And I think our team did a fantastic job of answering the call to provide these sorts of things for students who wanted that experience. But I'm sure that given the opportunity, all those people who graduated in the spring and those who will be graduating here in December will take the opportunity to want to do the in-person sort of exchange if we give them that opportunity later. And so I think you see this yearning for the students to get to something that they would call normal.
Yeah. So the commencement is the 11th, yes? December 11th?
That's what we call the December toast. Yep, coming right up. And luckily, I'm not producing that one. Early in the pandemic, just some different approaches to personnel, and some of our folks were being particularly cautious about wanting to get out of their house and actually do the producing. And I think I probably took more precautions during that than I would take these days. I remember wearing surgical gloves and other things that I probably wouldn't do now. But we knew a whole lot less in April than we know now about the virus. Um, and so I think it's easier for folks to come out of their house and do some work now, also given where we are and how many months this thing has gone on.
Well, you've talked about the silver linings, the lessons learned very succinctly, I guess. If you could, talk about what's happened in the 10 months and, anything learned that was really key to the future of, administering communications going forward.
Well, crisis communications is essential. Yeah. If I was going to sum it up in a sentence, that is the sentence. You've got to be ready. You've got to have a plan. You've got to know how to execute that plan, and you've got to stay steady with the plan. Mm-hmm. But also, when the pandemic or whatever your crisis is throws you a curve, and this crisis has had so many curves in it, and on top of it, not just one crisis, but some folks would say several crises, and an economic crisis, a racial reckoning crisis, other sorts of crises that were put on top of this. Be ready to flex, but be prepared.
Mm-hmm. I will keep you just another couple of minutes because that was one of the topics I did want to cover, the overlay of the George Floyd killing. Certainly, the effect of, all over the world essentially felt the effects of those visuals, those moments, and then the aftermath. Can you speak to that from your point of view and how an institution deals with that, please?
Sure, because that was a crisis laid over the crisis as I just spoke about, and it's a separate issue, but I think magnified by what was going on at the time, and I think we approached that in similar ways. Our approach was not just watch and see, but react and communicate. And so you see leadership, our chancellor, president, chief diversity officer, all working with us on different forms of communication. We wanted Webster to be a leader in Webster is a leader in talking about diversity and equity issues. And we said, look, we have a lot of material that we have done in the past. Can we repurpose things from our diversity conference, which our diversity, equity, and inclusion conference, that conference is probably the premier event now on those issues in St. Louis. Last February, before we all got into the pandemic, more than 1,600 people gathered for a 4-day conference to talk about these issues here at Webster. We'll do another one of those, although it'll be virtual this year. One of the things I think we're proudest of is the Webster Speaks series. This is a video, a webinar style series that the Chief Diversity Officer, Vincent Llewellyn, works with my team, the communications team. He is the host of this series, but we produce basically a video program around him, and I think we're about to do the maybe the 12th installment of that since the summer. We tend to do these on a biweekly basis. We've had tremendous discussions about these issues and about systemic racism and how to attack it, and some very heartfelt and interesting conversations that I would say difficult to find those sorts of conversations happening elsewhere in the St. Louis region, and these too have been shown internationally. We've had folks watching these series in Africa um, and other places. Altogether, I think more than 1,500 people have engaged in that series since the summer. So I told the chief diversity officer the other day, I told Vincent the other day, look, you produced a great conference last year in February. You've already produced another conference. If you look at all of the other pieces that we have, those are live webinar sessions on Wednesday evenings, but also they have a great life on YouTube, and they get many hundreds of new listeners and viewers on the YouTube channel. So I'm very proud of that initiative, and that is something that we worked hard on during the pandemic to deal with what is known as a second pandemic, the pandemic of racism.
Well, as a member of the Webster family, I have to say, very, very proud of the communications efforts. You can see you were all nimble. You reacted, and you were actually proactive. But the communications were tremendous, helpful, informative, and I obviously the university's been in command in that regard. How are you feeling? I should ask you.
It's funny when I tell people who know me for a long time, they know how hard I tend to work on projects. I said, I don't think I've ever worked harder in my life than now during the pandemic. And I know you can always look at the most recent crisis and say, oh, well, that one is the toughest one. But I have been through covering riots, covering hurricanes, the whole panoply of things that you get in the news business. This is the toughest thing. Mm-hmm. And the amount of days and hours I've spent not taking time off, but to be responsive for the community. I'm very proud of my unit. The division, the communications division at Webster, has really shown how hard they work, and working in ways providing quality, not just quantity of communication to folks. I think we've averaged since March about 2 communications a week to the community on issues that were urgent or emergency or of real importance, not just, and I'm not counting any of the things that go out for, fill out your health benefits or those sorts of things. I'm talking about unplanned communications to either get in front of something or be reactive to things. Some of that communication has slowed down in these last few months because, we're old pros now at the pandemic, been doing it for a long time. So we kind of know how these steps go. But in those early days when we made the pivot to completely remote operations, we might be sending out 4 or 5 urgent communications in a week. And those first few weeks were filled with those sorts of things. So it's hard work, but I know if it helps people and if it gets us through, then every bit of the sacrifice is worth it.
Rick, this has been tremendous. The St. Louis Press Club is honored to have had you speak with me today and to give of your time, because we know it's precious, and look forward to perhaps another conversation down the road. But thank you for your time, and best wishes. Be well, and happy holidays to you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. Happy holidays to you. As we always like to say at the end of the podcast, stay healthy, and safe.
Thank you. And the same.